All right, welcome everyone to the deep dive. Today we're gonna be taking a pretty valuable journey, I think, into the world of information security management. So we're gonna be looking at unpacking ISO 21001.2022 and its companion, ISO 27002.2022. Think of this deep dive as a shortcut to really getting a good understanding of these vital standards and how they can fit together to create a strong foundation for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And our mission in this deep dive is to give you, the listener, a really clear and thorough understanding of what ISO 27001.2022 actually requires. We'll then move into exploring the detailed guidance offered in ISO 27002.2022 for implementing, really effective information security controls. We're going to move from the fundamental principles all the way through to a more nuanced appreciation of how these standards work together.
And to do this, we're going to be going straight to the source. We've got excerpts here from the ISO IE C27 AC01.2022 standard itself, which lays out all those requirements, and we've got selections from the ISO IEC 27000.2022 standard, which has all the nitty-gritty guidance on specific information security controls that you can actually put in place.
Yeah, and what we'll be covering is pretty comprehensive. We're going to start by really breaking down those core requirements of ISO 27000. We'll look at everything from understanding your organization's own unique context all the way through to the really important role of leadership and planning. Then we'll dive deep into the structure and the specific controls detailed in ISO 27002, and these span, across organizational aspects, how people are involved, the physical security of your premises, and all the technology measures you can put in place. And then finally, we'll tie everything together and show you how these two standards really are designed to be used in concert to build and maintain a strong information security management system, or an ISMS, as you might hear it called.
Okay, so let's start unpacking this, starting with the foundation. The requirements laid out in ISO 2701.2022. And we'll pick off with Clause 4, which focuses on the context of your organization.
So what's fascinating here, and what's really the crucial first step, is that before even thinking about specific, security gadgets or software, ISO 27001 makes it really clear that you need to have a deep understanding of your own environment. Clause 4.1 talks about understanding the organization and its context. And this means really identifying those external factors like changes in regulations or the competitive landscape, and internal factors like your company culture or organizational structure that could impact your information security. And actually, the standard itself points out that this aligns with how ISO 31000.2010 week describes establishing the external and internal context. You can think of 31000 as, a guide for how organizations should approach and manage all sorts of risks, and really underscores that for you, security isn't just this isolated thing. It's really intertwined with every aspect of how you do business. So right from the start, information security is framed within this broader risk management perspective.
That makes total sense. You can't protect what you don't understand, right? And it's not just about the organization itself either, is it? Clause 4.2 gets into understanding the needs and expectations of interested parties. So who exactly are we talking about here?
Yeah. So the standard says that your organization needs to identify who these interested parties are, and this could be, customers, suppliers, regulatory bodies, your own employees, and then identify their requirements. So these could be, legal obligations, regulatory demands, contractual agreements, even just what these parties expect from you in terms of security. And crucially, your organization has to decide which of these requirements the ISMS will address. So this makes sure that your ISMS is really focused and relevant to those who have a stake in your security.
Okay. So you've got a handle on who and the what in terms of, context and interested parties. Clause 4.3 then guides organizations to define the where. So determining the scope of the ISMS, what does this mean on a practical level?
So the scope defines the boundaries and the applicability of the ISMS. And when you're figuring this out, your organization needs to think about those external and internal issues we just talked about, right? The requirements of those interested parties, and also any dependencies, any interfaces between your organization's activities and those performed by others. Think about, for example, outsourced IT functions. And this is super important for understanding where information security risks might come up or where they could have the biggest impact. And the scope, this is important. It needs to be documented. You can't just have a vague idea. You need to really clearly define what your ISMS covers and have it written down.
And all of this groundwork, this understanding of the context, the stakeholders, the scope, leads to Clause 4.4, which is about establishing the information security management system itself. So this is where it all comes together.
Yeah, this is really like the heart of ISO 27001. So this clause states that your organization shall establish, implement, maintain, and continually improve an ISMS, including all the processes and how they interact, all in accordance with the requirements in the standard. So it's not, a one-time project. It's an ongoing life cycle that needs constant attention.
Moving on, Clause 5 then shifts our focus to leadership, and it's really clear that the standard puts a strong emphasis on the role of top management in all of this.
Yeah, absolutely. Clause 5.1, leadership and commitment, really spells this out. So top management isn't just passively, giving the nod to the ISMS. They need to be actively involved in establishing it and keeping it going. This includes making sure that there's an information security policy and clear objectives, and that the resources, people, money, tools are available. Their commitment really sets the tone for the entire organization.
And speaking of policy, Clause 5.2 addresses that specifically. What kind of policy are we talking about here?
Right, so your organization needs to establish and maintain a clear information security policy. And this isn't just some, document that sits on a shelf. It needs to be communicated throughout the organization. Everyone needs to know about it. It has to be accessible, and it should reflect management's commitment to security and provide a high-level framework that guides all your security efforts.
And finally, within the leadership clause, we have 5.3, which deals with organizational roles, responsibilities, and authorities.
So this is about clarity, right? Making sure everyone knows their part in the information security story. These roles, who's responsible for what, who has the authority to make decisions, need to be defined and, again, communicated throughout the organization. This avoids confusion and ensures accountability.
So with the context understood and leadership established, Clause 6 takes us into planning. This is where the rubber meets the road, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Clause 6.1 focuses on actions to address risks and opportunities. And building on that understanding of context and requirements we talked about earlier, your organization needs to determine what are the risks, what are the opportunities related to information security. And the idea is to make sure the ISMS can achieve its outcomes.
Yeah.
Protect that valuable information, prevent or reduce any bad stuff, and get better over time. And importantly, you have to plan actions to tackle these risks and opportunities, integrate these actions into your ISMS processes, and figure out how you're going to measure if they're working.
And this leads to 6.2, which is all about setting those information security objectives and then planning how to achieve them.
Right. So your organization has to set those objectives, and they need to be measurable. And for each one, you need a plan. What are the steps? What resources? Time, money, people? Who's responsible? What's the timeline? And then how are you going to evaluate the results? It's really about having a project management approach to your security goals.
And Clause 6 wraps up with planning of changes. This seems like it's often overlooked, but so important.
Yeah, the standard recognizes that your ISMS is going to change, right?
Yeah.
Clause 6.3 emphasizes that when changes are needed, whether it's because of new threats, your business evolving, or lessons learned, those changes have to be planned and controlled. This helps you avoid any unintended consequences and make sure that you're not weakening security by accident.
Now we move into Clause 7, which covers support. And this section seems to focus on the resources and capabilities that an organization needs to have in place to make its ISMS work.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. Clause 7.1 just states that your organization has to provide the resources that are necessary for establishing, implementing, maintaining, and continually improving the ISMS. And this is broad, right? It includes things like financial investment, the right people, the infrastructure, think like secure facilities, and the technology you need.
Clause 7.2 then drills down into competence, which is obviously critical for any system.
For sure. So your organization needs to determine what level of competence is needed for the people doing work that could affect information security. And then you have to make sure those individuals actually have that competence, whether it's through education, training, experience. And it's not just initial skills. You also need to maintain awareness of current security issues and best practices.
Clause 7.4 addresses communication. We all know that's where things can often fall apart.
Absolutely. So the standard requires your organization to determine what information about the ISMS needs to be communicated, when, who it needs to be communicated with, both internally and externally, how to communicate it, and who's responsible. Having a good communication plan makes sure that the right information gets to the right people.
Finally, within support, we have Clause 7.5, which deals with documented information. This can sometimes feel like a burden, but it's essential for a well-functioning ISMS, right?
It really is.
Yeah.
Clause 7.5.1 General states that your ISMS needs to include all the documented information required by ISO 2701, as well as any other information that your organization thinks is necessary to make its ISMS effective. The important thing to remember is that the amount can vary depending on the size of your organization, how complex your processes are, the skill levels of your people. It's really about what you need, not just paperwork.
Clause 7.5.2 then covers the process of creating and updating that documented information.
Right, so this part ensures that when you create or update documents, they have proper identification, like a title and a version date. They're in the right format, and that they are reviewed and approved to make sure they're accurate and fit for purpose. This helps establish control and make sure the information you're relying on is actually trustworthy.
And finally, 7.5.3 focuses on the control of documented information.
Yeah, so this is about making sure that the information is available and suitable for use. It also emphasizes the need to protect this information from, unauthorized access, accidental changes, or loss of integrity.
Yeah.
The clause even specifies that your organization needs to manage things like distribution, access, storage, how changes are controlled, retention, and disposal. It even covers documented information that comes from outside your organization.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of foundational ground with those clauses. Now we're moving into Clause 9, performance evaluation. This is where you really take a step back and check how well your ISMS is performing.
Yeah, you got to measure to manage, right? So Clause 9.1 deals with monitoring, measurement, analysis, and evaluation. And your organization needs to figure out what needs to be monitored and measured. Is it how well your security controls are working? Are you meeting objectives? How often are incidents happening? You need to decide on your methods, how often you'll do it, who's responsible, and when you'll analyze and evaluate those results. And importantly, you need documented evidence of the results. You can't just say you're monitoring, you need to prove it.
Clause 9.2 focuses on internal audit, which is a key way to get an independent assessment of your ISMS.
Definitely a vital part. Clause 9.2.1 General just says that you need to do internal audits at planned intervals. This gives you that objective look at whether your ISMS conforms to both your own requirements and the requirements of ISO 27701, and whether it's being effectively implemented and maintained.
And 9.2.2 then gets into the specifics of setting up and running that internal audit program.
Right, so this clause requires your organization to plan, establish, implement, and maintain that audit program. This includes defining the scope, the criteria that will be used, the methods, and who is responsible for managing it all.
The final part of performance evaluation is Clause 9.3, management review. This brings us back to that crucial role of leadership in overseeing the ISMS.
Yes. Clause 9.3.1 General states that top management needs to review the ISMS at planned intervals. This makes sure leadership stays informed about how it's performing, what challenges it's facing, and allows them to make strategic decisions.
And 9.3.2 then gets into the management review inputs, so the information that needs to be considered during these reviews.
These inputs are really designed to give a good overview. They include things like the progress on actions from previous reviews, changes in the context, information on how the ISMS is performing, the results from monitoring, findings from audits, the status of any issues, feedback from interested parties, the outcomes of your risk assessment, and opportunities for improvement. It's a really holistic look at the health of your ISMS.
And then 9.3.3 specifies the management review results, the outcomes.
Right. So the outcomes of these reviews should include decisions related to opportunities for improvement, any changes needed for the ISMS, and any resource needs. And just like many other aspects, those results need to be documented.
We've reached the final clause of ISO 27001, which is Clause 10, improvement. This reinforces the fact that managing information security is an ongoing process.
Absolutely. Clause 10.1 focuses specifically on continual improvement. The standard makes it clear that you have to continuously work to improve how suitable, adequate, and effective your ISMS is. It's not about reaching a certain point and stopping, it's about adapting and evolving.
And Clause 10.2 deals with nonconformity and corrective action, which is essentially how you learn from mistakes.
Right, so when something doesn't meet the requirements, this clause lays out the steps. Contain and correct it, evaluate why it happened, take corrective action to prevent recurrence, implement those actions, review effectiveness, and make changes as needed. And, as we've seen throughout, document everything.
So that's a pretty comprehensive overview of the requirements in ISO 1075001. It really sets the stage for how an organization should approach information security management. Now let's move on to ISO 2702, which provides that detailed guidance on specific controls.
Yeah, and what's really useful about ISO 27002 is its structure. Clause 4 of the standard lays this out clearly. It's organized into 4 main themes, which makes navigating those controls much easier. So organizational controls are in Clause 5, people controls are in 6, physical controls in 7, and technological controls in 8. And in addition to these main clauses, there are 2 informative annexes. Annex A explains how to use attributes to create different views of the controls, and Annex B shows how the controls in the 2022 version relate to the 2013 version.
You mentioned these themes and also attributes. Clause 4.2 goes into more detail about these, right? Can you tell us a bit more about the attributes?
Yeah. The themes, organizational, people, physical, technological, are the primary way the controls are grouped. But ISO 27002 also introduces this idea of attributes. Think of these attributes as tags or characteristics that are associated with each control, and these give you different lenses through which you can view and categorize the controls. For example, each control has attributes like control type. Is it preventative, detective, or corrective? Information security properties, like confidentiality, integrity, availability, cybersecurity concepts, operational capabilities, security domains. So the idea that you can use these, or even create your own, to filter and sort the controls in ways that make sense for you. It's about making the information more useful.
And Clause 4.3 then describes that standard layout that you'll find for each control.
Exactly. So for each control, you get a consistent format, which makes it easy to understand. There's an attribute table, a control statement, the purpose, guidance, and sometimes other information. The guidance section can be quite detailed, and sometimes it even uses subheadings to break things down.
All right, let's dive into some specific examples, starting with the organizational controls in Clause 5. One that stands out is 5.1, Policies for Information Security.
This one's really foundational. It emphasizes that you need to have clear information security policies as well as topic-specific policies like acceptable use of devices or password management. And these policies need to be approved, published, communicated, and they need to be reviewed at planned intervals and whenever there is significant changes to make sure they stay relevant.
Another one in Clause 5 is 5.3, Segregation of Duties.
Yeah, this is a classic security principle. So this control says you should separate conflicting duties and areas of responsibility. And the guidance gives some really good examples, like who requests a change to a system, who approves that change, and who implements it shouldn't be the same person. Same with managing access rights and developing or using those systems. This applies to code management, system administration, even design and auditing of controls. The separation of duties is there to prevent a single individual from having too much control, which could lead to, errors, fraud, or even malicious activity.
Clause 5.7 talks about threat intelligence. This feels like it's becoming increasingly vital in today's world.
Oh, absolutely. So this control focuses on collecting and analyzing information about threats that could affect you. The goal is to create threat intelligence, those insights that help you understand your threat environment so you can be proactive. The standard outlines a whole process for you, identifying sources, collecting the information, processing it, analyzing it, and communicating it to the right people in your organization. And you can get this intelligence yourself, or you can rely on external sources like security vendors, government agencies, or industry groups. Think of it as an early warning system.
Moving on, 5.9 addresses the inventory of information and other assets. This feels pretty fundamental.
It is. This one requires you to develop and maintain an inventory of your information and assets, data, hardware, software, even physical locations, and you need to identify the owners. You can't protect what you don't know you have, right? And you need to know who's accountable. The standard emphasizes that this inventory needs to be accurate, up-to-date, consistent, and aligned with any other asset management systems you might have.
Another one is 5.15, access control. Pretty broad but essential.
For sure. So this one states that you need to have rules for controlling both physical access to your premises and logical access to information and systems. And these rules should be based on your needs and security requirements. The standard highlights some key principles, like defining who needs what type of access, securing the applications themselves, implementing physical entry controls, making sure information is shared on a need-to-know and need-to-use basis, and using the principle of least privilege, so only giving people the minimum access they need.
We also have 5.19, information security and supplier relationships. This seems particularly important these days.
Absolutely. Given how interconnected organizations are, you have to get this right. So this control says you need processes for managing security risks that come with suppliers. And the guidance covers a lot, like identifying and evaluating suppliers, defining security requirements in contracts, addressing confidentiality, data protection, incident management, audit rights, what happens at the end of the contract, even personnel and physical security requirements.
And lastly, for organizational controls, we have 5.24, Information security, incident management planning, and preparation.
Yeah. This is about being proactive,
Right.
right? Planning for those incidents. You need to define your processes, roles, and responsibilities. So you need procedures for how to respond, how to handle evidence, how to do a root cause analysis, and how to learn from each incident to improve your security.
Okay, let's shift gears and look at the people controls in Clause 6. We see 6.2, terms and conditions of employment.
This one's about making sure that your employees' responsibilities for information security are part of their contracts from day one.
And then there's 6.3, information security awareness, education, and training.
This is super important, probably your first line of defense. It emphasizes that you need regular awareness activities, education, and training for everyone. This includes things like password security, being aware of malware, understanding social engineering. A well-informed workforce is key to preventing a lot of security incidents.
Clause 6.4 addresses the disciplinary process.
Right? Not always fun to think about, but you need a way to address violations. This control requires you to have a formal process, and communicating it clearly sends a strong message about the importance of following those rules.
And finally, for people controls, we have 6.7, remote working.
This one has become so much more important. So this control focuses on protecting information when people are working remotely outside the traditional office. The guidance talks about things like the physical environment, secure communication channels, equipment security, responsibilities of the remote worker. It also mentions technologies like firewalls and malware protection for those devices.
Now we're on to Clause 7, the physical controls. 7.2 is physical security perimeters.
So this one is about protecting areas that contain information and assets. The standard discusses physical barriers, entry controls like access cards or guards, and monitoring things like CCTV. It's important to think about how these perimeters protect against both physical threats like someone breaking in and environmental threats like a fire.
Clause 7.4 then talks about physical security monitoring.
So this is about continuous monitoring to detect unauthorized access. It mentions things like video surveillance and different types of alarms, contact sensors, sound detectors, motion sensors, and of course you need to make sure those systems are protected themselves.
And then in Clause 7, we have 7.5, protecting against physical and environmental threats.
Yeah, so this one is about protecting your information and assets from threats like fire, flood, power outages, extreme temperatures, even vandalism. It's really important to conduct a thorough risk assessment to identify the specific threats that are relevant to you and then put in place safeguards. This might include, fire detection and suppression systems, backup power, water detection sensors, and climate control.
And finally, in Clause 7, we've got 7. Ness, secure disposal or reuse of equipment.
Yeah, this is where sensitive data can often leak if it's not done right. So this control emphasizes the importance of removing or overwriting any sensitive data and software before you get rid of equipment or reuse it. And the standard really highlights using methods like physical destruction shredding, drilling, or secure data wiping, rather than just deleting things, which often leaves data recoverable.
Now we arrive at Clause 8, which covers the technological controls. 8.3, access restrictions, seems like a fundamental control.
It is. It's about implementing those restrictions based on your requirements. So the guidance talks about not allowing anonymous access to sensitive information, using configurations to control who can access what, managing access rights and permissions, and even considering physical or logical isolation for sensitive applications or data.
Clause 8.7 addresses protection against malware. This feels like a constant battle.
Definitely a challenge. So this control says you need protection against malware, and you need to back that up with awareness and training for users. The guidance suggests a combination of malware detection and removal software. Think antivirus, anti-spyware, and user education.
Then there's 8.8, management of technical vulnerabilities.
This one's crucial, but it can be tough. So this control emphasizes that you need to obtain information about vulnerabilities in the systems you're using, evaluate your exposure, and then take action. This usually means patching, and having that accurate inventory we talked about is key here. You can't patch what you don't know about.
Clause 8.9 focuses on configuration management.
Right. This one is about making sure that your systems are configured correctly and securely. So you need to establish, document, implement, monitor, and review the configurations, including security settings of your hardware, software, services, and networks. The goal is to make sure things are working as intended, that any unauthorized changes don't weaken your security.
8.3 talks about information backup.
Yeah, backup is essential. So this control says you need to maintain and test backups of your information, software, and systems. And the guidance stresses having a clear policy How are backups done? How often? Where are they stored? How do you test the restoration? It's about making sure you can actually recover that data if something happens.
Clause 8.15 is logging. This is important for both monitoring and investigations.
Absolutely. This control focuses on producing, storing, protecting, and analyzing logs of activities, exceptions, faults, and other events. And having synchronized time sources across your systems is important here. This lets you correlate logs from different sources, which is really helpful for analysis and investigation.
8.20 addresses network security.
Yeah, so this control is about implementing security measures to protect your networks and connected services. It covers a lot, including responsibilities, documentation, safeguards for data, logging and monitoring, authentication, firewalls, hardening devices, and even security for virtualized networks.
8.23 is web filtering.
So this is about managing access to external websites. The idea is to reduce exposure to malicious content. And the guidance suggests considering blocking access to sites that have file upload functions, sites that are known to be malicious, command and control servers, and websites with illegal or inappropriate content.
8.24 talks about the use of cryptography.
This is all about protecting data confidentiality and integrity. You need to define rules for how cryptography is used, and a key part of this is key management, how you generate, store, protect, and eventually destroy those keys. And the guidance covers selecting algorithms, protecting keys, and any legal requirements for encryption.
We also have 8.28, secure coding.
This one's really about building security into your software right from the start. If you're developing software, you need to use secure coding practices throughout the development lifecycle to reduce vulnerabilities and make it more resilient.
8.32 covers change management.
Yeah, so this control is about establishing a formal change management process. You need to make sure changes are authorized, planned, tested, and implemented in a controlled way to minimize disruptions and avoid new security risks.
And finally, for technological controls, we have 8.33, test information.
This one's important because often you're using copies of real data for testing, and that data needs to be protected. You want to make sure your testing is effective, but you also want to protect any sensitive information that might be involved.
Yeah, so we've covered a lot of those controls detailed in ISO 27002. It really gives you a comprehensive catalog of measures to consider. But now let's talk about how ISO 27001 and 27002 actually work together.
Yeah, so the connection between these two standards is really important. Think of it this way. 27001 provides the framework. It sets out the requirements. And 27002 provides the how, the details. So 27001 says you need an ISMS. 27002 gives you the controls to build it.
And they kind of point to each other, right? You're not meant to use them separately.
Exactly. So Annex A of ISO 27001 is actually mandatory, and it lists controls that are aligned with those in ISO 27002. And there's a note in 27000 that specifically directs you to Annex A when you're planning your risk treatment. So while you can use controls from other sources, Annex A and 27002 are really the recommended place to start.
So to summarize our deep dive today,
well, we've seen that ISO 27701.20222 lays out the requirements for establishing and managing your ISMS. It covers everything from context and stakeholders to leadership, planning, support functions, performance evaluation, and continual improvement.
and we've also looked at how ISO 27002.2022 provides this huge catalog of controls organized by theme with guidance on implementation. And you can use this standard to pick the controls that make sense for you.
Understanding these two standards is so valuable for any organization that wants to build and maintain a strong information security posture. It's a proactive approach to protecting your information assets, meeting expectations, minimizing risks, and ensuring business continuity in our digital world.
And here's a final thought to consider. How can you go beyond just checking boxes when implementing controls? How can you create a culture of security that's always learning and adapting?
That's a great question. And I would encourage you to explore the full standards, think about how they apply to your organization, and dive deeper into any areas that were particularly interesting.
Thanks for joining us. Until next time.